Vega Ashford's body arced backward, every muscle locked rigid as 15,000 volts of ancient technology burned through her augmented nervous system. Her skin glowed from within circuit patterns of emerald light tracing across green flesh. The holographic display climbed with agonizing slowness. 14.8%, 14.9. Cassidy Thorne gripped her hand, heedless of the burning heat, and whispered through tears, "You are not a weapon. You are my family. Come back to us." 15.0. Environmental shield activated. The valley was saved. But 3 weeks earlier, Cassidy Thorne had nothing but $420, a rusted container on a dying ridge, and a door she was about to open to two strangers in a storm. A choice that would transform a poisoned wasteland into paradise and turn 6 warriors into the architects of revolution. This is the story of that choice. There is a specific kind of atmospheric decay that settles into your bones when you have lived too long in a place designed to kill you slowly. It is not the sharp terror of a blade or the sudden violence of fire. It is the gentle, persistent erosion of hope, the kind that tastes like rust and copper in the back of your throat, the kind that makes you forget what clean air feels like against your skin. For Cassidy Thorne, this erosion had become the rhythm of her existence. Her home was a decommissioned freight container perched on the eastern ridge of Dust Valley, Nevada, where the earth itself seemed to have given up on the idea of life. The container was a skeletal argument with gravity, its titanium walls pitted with corrosion from decades of exposure to the valley's toxic silica winds. The main hatch hung on a damaged pneumatic hinge, creating a persistent whistle that had become the soundtrack of her loneliness. The interior was a testament to the kind of poverty that does not announce itself with dramatic collapse, but with the slow accumulation of broken things that never get fixed. A cot with a frame welded from scrap rebar, a water filtration unit that had not worked properly in 3 years and left everything tasting vaguely of iron, a portable heater that cycled between temperatures with the unpredictability of a dying heart, and in the corner beneath a sheet of carbon fiber tarp, the workbench, where Cassidy Thorne counted the last of her money. 42 $10 bills, $420. She had arranged them in neat stacks on the surface of a salvaged crate, her fingers moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed this ritual too many times. No matter how she stacked them, no matter how she rearranged the worn paper, the mathematics remained brutally simple. It was not enough to pay the oxygen tax. It was not enough to repair the filtration system. And it was certainly not enough to appease Vincent Cade, the enforcer who represented Helix Corporation's interests in the lower valley. Cassidy was 32 years old, but the reflection that sometimes caught her in the polished surface of a pressure gauge looked closer to 45. Poverty on a mining settlement does not just drain your bank account. It leaches the calcium from your bones and carves lines into your face that have nothing to do with laughter. Her dark hair, once thick and glossy, now hung in brittle strands that she tied back with whatever wire or cord she could find. Her hands, calloused and scarred from years of mechanical work, moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned early that time wasted was food not earned. She reached up to her neck, her fingers closing around the object that hung there on a frayed paracord. The Genesis key. It was a jagged, multi-pronged device of ancient design, its surface etched with symbols that predated the corporate consolidation of the American Southwest. Her father had given it to her on his deathbed 2 years ago, his voice a thin rasp in the sterile silence of the Helix medical ward. "Cassidy," he had whispered, his weathered hand gripping hers with surprising strength. "This opens the path to something better. Your grandfather found it in the old Vexton facility. I spent 30 years trying to understand what it unlocks. I never figured it out, but I know it is important. Promise me you will keep it safe." She had promised, and for 2 years she had tried every interface port, every access panel, every piece of pre-consolidation technology she could find in the valley's scrap heaps. The key remained inert, a beautiful, useless piece of history that served only to remind her of her father's wasted years and her own mounting failures. The sound that interrupted her counting was not the usual groan of the valley's tectonic instability. It was the deliberate crunch of boots on the gravel path that led up the ridge. Cassidy froze her hands, still hovering over the money. In Dust Valley, visitors meant one of two things: debt collection or desperation, violent enough to overcome common sense. She stood her joints protesting with soft pops that sounded obscenely loud in the container's thin atmosphere. Through the grainy feed of her external sensor, she could see a single figure approaching. Tall, thin, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew they had the law, or at least the corporate approximation of it, on their side. Vincent Cade. He was dressed in the pristine charcoal suit that marked him as Helix Management, a stark contrast to the dust-stained coveralls worn by everyone else in the valley. His face was narrow and sharp, like something carved from bone and polished to an uncomfortable shine. Two security drones flanked him, their optical sensors glowing a dull red in the fading afternoon light. Cassidy grabbed a plasma wrench from the bench. It was a pathetic weapon against corporate enforcement, but the weight of it in her hand made her feel fractionally less powerless. She keyed the manual release on the hatch. The door groaned open, venting a small puff of recycled air into the valley's thin atmosphere. Vincent Cade stood in the threshold, his expression a carefully calibrated mixture of professional courtesy and barely concealed contempt. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the flat, affectless tone of someone reading from a script, "you are now 48 hours past your payment deadline. Helix Corporation policy dictates that I inform you of the consequences of continued noncompliance." Cassidy tightened her grip on the wrench. "I have $420, Cade. It is all I have. You can take it now, or you can give me another week to earn the rest." Cade's smile was a thin, bloodless thing. "The outstanding balance, including accumulated interest and late fees, now stands at $2,860. Your partial payment would be noted but insufficient." "Then what are you suggesting?" "Helix Corporation is always seeking laborers for the deep shaft operations. The work is demanding and the atmosphere is suboptimal, but the debt is discharged upon completion of a 3-year contract, assuming, of course, that you survive the term." The deep shafts. Everyone in Dust Valley knew what that meant. Uranium extraction in unshielded tunnels, where the radiation levels turned your bone marrow to jelly and your lungs to wet concrete. A 3-year contract was a death sentence spread out over 1,000 days. "I'm an engineer, not a miner," Cassidy said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I can work off the debt here. Give me 6 months. 6. I will scavenge triple shifts in the old Vexton ruins." Cade glanced past her, his eyes scanning the interior of the container with the practiced efficiency of someone cataloging assets for seizure. His gaze landed on the Genesis key hanging around her neck. "What is that?" he asked, stepping forward. Cassidy's hand went reflexively to the key. "Family heirloom, not for sale." "Everything is for sale, Miss Thorne. The question is merely one of price." He reached out his fingers, extending toward the key with the slow, deliberate motion of a spider approaching prey. The crack of static discharge made them both freeze. One of Cade's security drones had suddenly listed to the side, its optical sensor flickering erratically. Then, with a sound like metal tearing, it collapsed into a heap of smoking components. Cade spun around his hand, going to the compact pulse pistol holstered at his hip. "What?" The second drone exploded in a shower of sparks and melting plastic. Through the settling smoke, Cassidy saw 2 figures standing at the base of the ridge path. They were impossible. They were twins, identically perfect in the way only genetic engineering could achieve. They stood at least 6 feet 4 inches tall, their bodies wrapped in battered ceramic armor, scarred by high-velocity impacts and energy burns. But it was their skin that stopped Cassidy's breath in her throat. It was a deep, lustrous green, the color of forest canopy in a world that had forests. Their hair was a cascade of obsidian black braided tightly with fiber optic cables that pulsed with faint amber light. Their eyes glowed with that same amber luminescence, and in those eyes Cassidy saw something that made her chest tighten. Exhaustion. Bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion. These were not soldiers on a hunt. These were survivors on a ledge. "Augmented," Cade breathed, and there was genuine fear in his voice for the first time. "Red list augmented." The one on the left stepped forward, her movements economical and precise. When she spoke, her voice was a low rasp, like gravel grinding in a centrifuge. "Human," she said, her amber eyes fixed on Cassidy. "Do you understand common speech?" Cassidy nodded, finding her voice trapped somewhere in her throat. "We have been walking for 6 days." The second twin said, her posture less aggressive, shoulders slumped under the weight of a heavy tactical pack. Every outpost, every station, every HAB unit, they see the skin and they cycle the locks. We have credits. We can pay. We need one night of pressurized air away from the dust. Cade found his voice. These are military assets. Helix Corporation property. Deserters, if you shelter them, Miss Thorne, you will be complicit in leave. The word came from the first twin, and it was not a request. She had not drawn a weapon, but her hand rested on the grip of a pulse rifle maglocked to her thigh. The human and I are conducting business. You are interrupting. Cade's face had gone the color of old wax. He took a step backward, then another. Director Cole will hear about this. Harboring augmented deserters is a capital offense under corporate charter. Then tell him, the twin said. Tell him Vega Ashford is here. Tell him his best weapon has gone rogue. See how much he cares about your debt collection. Cade turned and ran. Actually ran, his polished shoes slipping on the gravel as he fled down the ridge path. Cassidy watched him go, her mind struggling to process the past 90 seconds. Then she turned back to the two women standing at her door. Up close, they were even more striking. The one who had spoken first, Vega, had a scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline, a pale line against her green skin. The second twin had a cybernetic left arm, the metal polished to a mirror shine, and etched with the same glowing amber circuitry as the cables in their hair. I am Vega, the scarred one said. This is my sister Lyric. We thank you for not turning us away. I have not agreed to anything yet, Cassidy said, though even as she spoke, she knew it was a lie. She had seen the fear in Cade's eyes. She had seen the exhaustion in theirs. The decision had already been made in the space between heartbeats. She looked past them. The horizon was beginning to glow with the harsh, unfiltered light of the setting sun, and behind it a wall of dust was rising. A silica storm, the kind that could strip unprotected skin down to muscle in minutes. Cassidy looked at the twins, then back at her miserable, leaking home. She thought about the $420 on her workbench and the Genesis key around her neck. The smart thing would be to close the door, to apologize and seal the hatch and pretend this encounter had never happened. But as she looked at them, Cassidy realized they wore the same expression she saw every time she passed through the corporate district uptown. Invisible, unwanted, waiting for the inevitable rejection. The air recycler is failing, Cassidy said, her voice surprising her with its steadiness. Internal pressure is low and the temperature barely holds at 68 degrees. I have half a carton of synthetic protein paste and a water filter that makes everything taste like rust. The floor is cold and the walls are thin. The twins stared at her, their amber eyes unblinking, waiting for the final word of dismissal. But you can sleep here, Cassidy continued, if you do not mind sharing space with a woman who has nothing left but her debts. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of 100 unspoken questions. Lyric, the twin with the cybernetic arm, let out a short, sharp breath. It might have been a laugh, or perhaps just the sound of a spirit finally allowed to rest. You are serious, she asked. Terrified, Cassidy corrected. But yes, get inside before the storm hits. My sensors say the silica count is rising. They stepped into the container and the hatch hissed shut behind them. The arrival of two 6'4" warriors in a space designed for a single human created immediate logistical complications. Vega had to hunch her shoulders to avoid hitting the overhead conduits. Lyric moved with a fluid grace that spoke of years navigating cramped military transports, her eyes scanning the room with professional tactical precision. Your dwelling is functional, Vega said, her gaze landing on the leaking coolant line in the corner. It is a disaster, Cassidy replied, moving to the workbench to gather her money before it was stepped on. But it is my disaster. Feel free to sit. The floor is reinforced titanium. It can handle the weight of your armor. And they sat folding their massive frames into the cramped corner near the heating vent. The absurdity of the situation hit Cassidy then. A scrap engineer and two of the most feared warriors in the American territories huddling together against a desert storm. I am Cassidy, she said, offering a small, awkward nod. Cassidy Thorne. People call me Cass. We thank you for the air, Vega said. Do not thank me yet, Cassidy muttered, reaching for the half-empty carton of protein paste. Wait until you taste the food. But Lyric was already reaching into her pack, pulling out a vacuum-sealed tube. We have rations. Military-grade higher calorie density than your paste. You should eat. You look like you are one power failure away from collapse. I am fine, Cassidy lied, though her stomach gave a treacherous growl. Eat, Vega commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. We do not accept charity without providing return. You gave us air. We give you fuel. They ate in a strange, tense silence. The augmented rations tasted like chalk and vitamins, but Cassidy could feel the energy surging through her system almost immediately. It was the first time in months she had felt truly awake. Outside, the storm hit. The sound was like 1,000 tiny claws scraping against the container's exterior, a rhythmic assault that made conversation nearly impossible. But in the quiet between the gusts, Cassidy found herself studying her unexpected guests. Their armor was covered in markings she did not recognize. Serial numbers, unit designations, and beneath those scratched-out symbols that looked like attempts at erasure. Lyric's cybernetic arm bore scars of its own places where the metal had been crudely repaired with materials that did not quite match the original alloy. "Where are you going?" Cassidy asked after they had finished eating. "There is nothing east of here but the great salt flats and the abandoned industrial sectors." Yet Vega and Lyric exchanged a look, a fast, silent communication that seemed to happen in a fraction of a second. "Away," Vega said. "Away from Helix Corporation. Away from the wars they make us fight for resources we do not need. We were told there are free settlements in the Rim territories." "The Rim is 300 miles away," Cassidy noted. "You would need long-range transport, and the transit stations are all controlled by corporate security. You will never get past the biometric scanners." "We will find a way," Lyric said, though there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "We have credits. We have skills." "You have targets on your backs," Cassidy corrected. She reached up and touched the Genesis key. "This valley is a prison. The only way out is through the corporate gate, and they do not open it for anyone without gold-tier clearance." Vega stood her head, nearly brushing the ceiling conduits. She walked over to Cassidy and looked at the key round her neck. "What is that?" she asked. "Some kind of access device?" "It is a piece of junk," Cassidy said, pulling it out to show her. "My father thought it was important. He spent 30 years trying to figure out what it opened. In the end, it just opened a hole in our savings." Vega leaned in, her eyes narrowing. She reached out a hand, her scarred fingers hovering over the metal. "May I?" Cassidy shrugged and took the cord off her neck, handing it to her. Vega held the key with a reverence that made Cassidy uncomfortable. She turned it over, studying the crystalline inserts in the micro-etched circuitry. "This is not junk," Vega whispered. "This is pre-consolidation technology. Vexton Biotech. My unit was once assigned to guard a research facility in the Northern Territories. I saw symbols like these on the mainframe of their secured vaults." "It does not work," Cassidy insisted. "I have tried it on every interface in the valley. It has been dead for decades." "Maybe it is not dead," Lyric said, joining her sister. "Maybe it just has not found the right lock." The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from the proximity sensor. Cassidy's heart skipped. She turned to the monitor. The storm was beginning to clear, and in the fading light she could see a figure approaching the ridge. Not Cade, someone else. The figure was massive, easily as tall as Vega and Lyric, but moving with a different kind of grace. As it drew closer, Cassidy saw that it was not one figure, but four. Four more, augmented. They moved in a tactical formation, their armor different from the twins, but bearing the same signs of long use and desperate repair. When they reached the base of the ridge, the lead figure raised a hand in a gesture that was not quite a wave and not quite a salute. Cassidy keyed the external speaker. "Who are you?" The lead figure stepped forward, and in the fading light, Cassidy could see she was older than Vega and Lyric. Her green skin was lined with age, her hair streaked with gray. One eye had been replaced with a crude cybernetic implant that glowed a dull red. "My name is Sage," the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of command even through the tinny speaker. "We picked up a signal on the deserter frequencies. Word travels fast in our network. They said two of our own had found shelter with a human woman who was brave enough to stand against Helix enforcement." Cassidy looked at Vega and Lyric. They were standing now, their bodies tense, ready for either fight or flight. "We are not here to cause trouble," Sage continued. "We are here to offer help. My companions and I have supplies, engineering equipment, power converters. enough to turn this ridge into something defensible. Why? Cassidy asked. Why would you help me? Sage smiled, and it was a tired, sad expression. Because we have been walking for a long time, Miss Thorne, and we are tired of walking. You gave two of our sisters a choice when everyone else gave them a door in the face. That means something to us. The other three figures moved forward. One was a man tall and broad-shouldered with a scar that bisected his face. Another was a pair of twins younger than Vega and Lyric, their armor painted with faded unit insignias. This is Theron, Sage said, gesturing to the scarred man, and these are Bryn and Sterling. We were builders before Helix made us into weapons. If you are willing to lead, we are willing to follow. Cassidy looked at the 6 augmented warriors standing in her yard. Her mind was screaming that this was madness. 6 deserters in one place was a provocation. Helix Corporation would see this as a threat, a cancer that needed to be excised with extreme prejudice. But as she looked at them, she saw something else. She saw people who had been used and discarded, who had been told they were weapons and nothing more. She saw the same exhaustion that had been eating at her for 2 years. If you stay, Cassidy said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest, we are going to have a problem. Vincent Kate is going to report this. They will send enforcers. Maybe worse. Let them come, Vega said, her hand resting on her pulse rifle. No, Cassidy said firmly. Not like that. If we are going to do this, we do it smart. We are not going to be a target. We are going to be the fortress. Sage's smile widened. What did you have in mind? Cassidy looked around at her miserable container, at the dying valley, at the impossible assembly of warriors waiting for her answer. She thought about the $420 and the Genesis key, and the 30 years her father had spent searching for a lock that did not exist. And she made a choice. We are going to fix this place, Cassidy said. Not just my unit, the whole valley. Every failing recycler, every broken heater, every family that is one storm away from suffocation. We are going to show Helix Corporation that we do not need their charity. We do not need their debt. We just need each other. Vega looked at Lyric. Lyric looked at Sage. Sage looked at Theron, Bryn, and Sterling. And slowly, one by one, they nodded. Then we have work to do, Sage said. And as the storm finally broke and the stars emerged in the vast Nevada sky, Cassidy Thorne realized that the void was no longer empty. She had found a family in the shadows of the corporate empire. And for the first time in 2 years, the air in her container tasted like hope. The transformation of Dust Valley did not happen with dramatic fanfare or the sudden magic of corporate intervention. It happened the way all real revolutions happen, one broken machine at a time, one repaired promise at a time, one small act of defiance that accumulated into something that could not be ignored. By the 3rd day, Cassidy Thorne had stopped counting her money. The $420 sat untouched on her workbench, a relic of a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Instead, she counted other things. The number of air recyclers brought back online. The number of families who no longer went to bed wondering if they would wake up choking. The number of times she saw Ruth Wagner smile. The old woman had been the first test of their new arrangement. Ruth Wagner was 70 years old and had lived on the Eastern Ridge longer than anyone could remember. Her container was a rusted monument to persistence, covered in hand-painted warnings about trespassers and corporate overreach. She had watched 3 generations of Helix enforcers come and go, had buried 2 husbands in the valley's toxic soil, and had developed a reputation for being exactly the kind of stubborn that kept people alive in impossible places. When she saw Vega and Lyric walking up the path toward her unit on the morning of the 4th day, she had grabbed a plasma cutter and positioned herself in her doorway like a biological barricade. I do not care what Cassidy Thorne thinks she is doing, Ruth had said, her voice carrying the gravel of 1,000 dust storms. You green-skinned abominations are not welcome near my home. Cassidy had been there standing slightly behind the twins, watching the confrontation with her heart in her throat. This was the moment she knew. If they could not win over Ruth Wagner, they would never win over the valley. But it was not Vega who had stepped forward. It was Lyric. The younger twin had approached slowly, her cybernetic arm held carefully away from her body, non-threatening. She had stopped 3 feet from Ruth's doorway and pointed at the hatch frame. Your door seal is compromised, Lyric had said, her voice carrying none of the defensive anger that Cassidy had expected. The pressure differential is causing a 0.8% oxygen loss per hour. In 12 days, your atmospheric recycler will not be able to compensate. You will suffocate in your sleep. Ruth had stared at her, the plasma cutter wavering slightly. I can fix it, Lyric continued. It will take 20 minutes. I will not enter your home. I will work from outside. You can keep that cutter pointed at my head the entire time if it makes you feel safer. Why, Ruth had asked, and beneath the suspicion, Cassidy had heard something else. Confusion, the bewilderment of someone who had spent 7 decades being told that survival was a solitary endeavor. Because Miss Thorne gave us a choice when no one else would, Lyric said. She saw us as people, not weapons. I am trying to learn how to do the same. Ruth had lowered the plasma cutter, not completely, but enough. 23 minutes later, Ruth Wagner's door had sealed with the kind of solid, reassuring click that spoke of precision engineering. The old woman had run her hand along the frame testing it, and when she looked up at Lyric, there had been tears on her weathered face. It does not squeak, Ruth had whispered. For 40 years, that damn door has squeaked every time I opened it, and now it does not squeak. She had looked past Lyric to Cassidy, and in that look, Cassidy had seen the moment the valley began to change. A woman did this, Ruth had said softly. A 32-year-old woman did what Helix Corporation could not do in 4 decades. She brought people together. That had been the beginning. Now 2 weeks into what Cassidy had started calling the Great Repair, the eastern ridge of Dust Valley hummed with a kind of purposeful energy that felt almost alien. The sound of plasma welders and hydraulic tools echoed off the container walls. Voices called out technical specifications and measurements. Children who had spent their entire lives indoors now played in the open air. Their laughter a sound so rare that it made some of the older residents stop and weep. Cassidy stood on the roof of her container, a data pad in her hands, reviewing the schematics she had been refining for the past week. The master plan was ambitious to the point of delusion, but every time she thought about scaling it back, she remembered Ruth's door and pushed forward. The goal was simple in concept, nightmarish in execution: transform the scattered, isolated containers of the eastern ridge into a unified, self-sustaining habitat grid. Connect the power systems so that solar arrays could be shared across multiple units. Link the water filtration network so that breakdowns in one section would not leave families without drinking water. Create redundancy resilience community. Make them strong enough that Helix Corporation would have to acknowledge them as something other than debts to be collected. Below her, she could see the organized chaos of the work crews. Vega and Theron were in the northern sector, training a group of volunteers in basic defensive tactics, not military drills Cassidy had insisted. Community protection protocols, how to identify threats, how to secure perimeters, how to coordinate response without escalating to violence. Theron had been skeptical at first. He was a man built for violence, his body a roadmap of scars that told the story of 100 combat deployments. But Cassidy had seen something in him during their first planning session. Beneath the warrior exterior, there was a builder, someone who understood structure and stability. You were a structural engineer, Cassidy had said, not quite a question. Theron had nodded slowly. Before Helix recruited me for the augmented program. I built bridges in the northern territories, designed load-bearing frameworks for atmospheric processors. Then you understand what I am trying to do here. I understand that you are trying to build something that will stand when the storms come, Theron had replied. But storms are not the only thing that tears down structures, Miss Thorne. Sometimes it is the people aside them. Then we build it strong enough to handle both, Cassidy had said. Now watching Theron demonstrate proper pressure point defense to a group of miners who looked like they had never thrown a punch in their lives, Cassidy felt a flicker of something that might have been pride. These were not soldiers, but they were learning to protect what mattered. In the western sector, Lyric and Sterling were elbow-deep in the guts of a communal water purification system. The two engineers worked with a synchronized efficiency that came from shared purpose rather than shared genetics. Their hands moving in complementary patterns as they rewired filtration membranes and replaced corroded piping. Sterling was characteristically quiet, her movements precise and economical. She spoke only when necessary, offering technical observations in a voice that carried no inflection. But Cassidy had noticed the way Sterling's eyes would track the children playing in the compound, the way her hands would still for just a moment when their laughter reached her. Something haunted that young woman, something that sat behind her amber eyes like a weight she carried alone. Sage and Bryn had taken on the most challenging task community organizing. It was not enough to fix machines, Sage had explained. They needed to fix trust. They needed to create systems where people felt invested in the collective success. Cassidy had watched Sage work with something approaching awe. The older, augmented woman moved through the valley like a force of nature, her gray-streaked hair and weathered face commanding a respect that transcended the fear of her green skin. She organized food distribution networks, established medical protocols, created work schedules that ensured everyone contributed without burning out. "You have led before," Cassidy had observed one evening, watching Sage coordinate a supply inventory with the efficiency of a military quartermaster. "I was a settlement coordinator on the Jovian mining colonies," Sage had replied, "before the corporate consolidation, before Helix decided that colonies were more profitable when they were scared. What happened? They needed soldiers more than they needed administrators. So they took us, broke us down, rebuilt us as weapons, and told us it was an honor to serve." Sage had looked at Cassidy with her one biological eye, the cybernetic replacement glowing softly in the dim light. "You remind me of who I used to be, Miss Thorne. Someone who believed that people were worth saving." "I still believe that," Cassidy had said. "I know. That is why we are here." The rhythm of the work became its own kind of meditation. Wake before dawn, review the day's priorities, coordinate with the team leads, solve the inevitable crises that arose when you were trying to build infrastructure with salvaged parts and borrowed hope. Sleep for a few hours. Repeat. Cassidy's hands, already calloused from years of mechanical work, developed new scars. Her back ached from hours spent crawling through access tunnels. Her eyes burned from reviewing schematics on screens that flickered in the unreliable power grid. But every night when she finally collapsed onto her cot, she felt something she had not felt in 2 years. Purpose. On the 14th day, the storm came. Not a silica storm, something worse. Cassidy was working on a particularly stubborn power coupling when she noticed Sterling standing alone at the edge of the compound, staring at something in the distance. The young, augmented woman's posture was rigid, her cybernetic arm locked in a position that suggested internal conflict. Cassidy set down her tools and walked over. "Sterling, what is wrong?" Sterling did not respond immediately. She was watching Jasper, the 7-year-old son of Marin, who lived 3 units down the ridge. The boy was playing with a toy drone, his laughter bright and unself-conscious as he chased the small machine through the dusty yard. "He is happy," Sterling said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Cassidy agreed. "His mother says he has not coughed in a week. The air quality improvements are working." Sterling's hands were trembling. Cassidy could see the micro-movements, the way her fingers opened and closed in a rhythm that spoke of suppressed memory. "Sterling, what is it?" 3 years ago," Sterling said, and her voice had changed. It was hollow now, scraped clean of anything resembling warmth. "I was part of a special operations unit. Helix sent us to a settlement in northern Arizona. Unauthorized occupation of corporate mineral rights. We were told to clear the site." Cassidy felt her stomach tighten. "There were 53 people in that settlement." Sterling continued, her eyes still fixed on Jasper. 17 of them were children. We were ordered to leave no witnesses, no complications, just empty the site and return to base." The toy drone buzzed past them and Jasper's laughter followed it. "I saw a girl," Sterling whispered. "She was maybe 5 years old. She had a teddy bear, and she was hiding behind a water tank. I found her there. She looked up at me with these huge brown eyes, and she asked me if I was there to help." Sterling's cybernetic arm locked completely, a soft whine of servos struggling against her neural command. Director Cole was on the comms. He said, "Execute Protocol Sterling, or I will replace you with a model that does not hesitate." I remember thinking that if I did not pull the trigger, someone else would. Someone who would not even pause. Someone who would not see her as human. Tears were streaming down Sterling's green face, now cutting tracks through the dust. So I pulled the trigger, and then I pulled it 16 more times. And when we left that settlement, there was nothing alive except the wind. Cassidy reached out slowly, carefully, and placed her hand on Sterling's shoulder. The augmented woman flinched but did not pull away. I do not deserve to be here, Sterling said, her voice breaking. I do not deserve to help build anything. I am a killer. I murdered a child who trusted me. You were a weapon, Cassidy said quietly. They made you a weapon and pointed you at targets and told you that was all you could ever be. That does not change what I did. No, Cassidy agreed, it does not. Nothing changes what you did. But what you choose to do now, that is yours. Not Helix's, not Cole's, yours. Sterling finally looked at her, and in those amber eyes, Cassidy saw the same desperate, drowning need for redemption that she had felt every time she counted her money and knew it would never be enough. Jasper is alive because of the work you did on his mother's recycler, Cassidy continued. 3 other families are breathing clean air because of your engineering. That does not erase what you did in Arizona. But it matters. It matters to them. It matters to me. How can you stand to look at me? Sterling asked. Because I see what you are becoming, Cassidy said, not what you were forced to be. They stood there for a long moment, 2 women carrying different weights, finding something like balance in the shared acknowledgement of imperfection. Thank you, Sterling whispered. For what? For seeing me as more than a weapon. That night, Cassidy could not sleep. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling of her container, thinking about Sterling's confession, thinking about the settlement in Arizona, thinking about all the ways that systems broke people down and rebuilt them into shapes that fit corporate profit margins. She thought about her father spending 30 years trying to understand the Genesis key, dying without ever knowing what it opened. She thought about the $420 that still sat on her workbench, uncounted and irrelevant. And she thought about the choice she had made 2 weeks ago when she had opened her door to 2 exhausted warriors in the middle of a storm. The external proximity alarm chirped softly. Cassidy sat up, her heart immediately accelerating. Middle-of-the-night visitors meant trouble. She pulled on her jacket and grabbed her datapad, checking the external sensors. A single vehicle approaching, not a Helix enforcement transport. Something smaller, a corporate luxury cruiser. Cassidy keyed the comms. Vega, we have incoming. I see it. Vega's voice came back immediately. The augmented woman slept in 4-hour shifts, always ready. Single occupant, no visible weapons, but the vehicle signature matches executive class. Wake everyone, Cassidy said. Quiet protocol. By the time the cruiser reached the edge of the compound, 20 people were awake and positioned at strategic points throughout the grid. They were not soldiers, but they had learned from Theron, and Vega. They knew how to create defensive positioning without looking aggressive. The cruiser's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, perhaps 58 or 60, with silver hair, and a face that carried the kind of refined exhaustion that came from decades of difficult decisions. He wore a suit that probably cost more than every container on the ridge combined, but he moved with the careful precision of someone who understood he was surrounded. Director Brennan Cole. Cassidy had seen his face before in corporate broadcasts and enforcement bulletins. The architect of the augmented program. The man who had turned genetic engineering into a weapon of corporate expansion. He stopped 10 feet from where Cassidy stood, his hands visible and empty. Miss Cassidy Thorne, he said, and his voice was quieter than she had expected. Almost gentle. May we speak? We are speaking, Cassidy replied. Cole smiled, and there was genuine sadness in it. Privately, if possible. What I have to say concerns the 6 individuals you have given shelter to. Vega materialized from the shadows to Cassidy's left, her pulse rifle held in a ready position that was not quite aimed, but not quite safe either. Director Vega said, and the single word carried layers of history and hatred. Cole looked at her, and something complex moved across his face. Recognition, regret, something that might have been love, if love could be filtered through corporate necessity. Hello, Vega. Hello, Lyric. He nodded to where Lyric had appeared on Cassidy's right. You look well, better than the last time I saw you. The last time you saw us, you were signing our termination orders, Lyric said flatly. Yes, Cole agreed. I was. And you were wise to run. He turned his attention back to Cassidy. May we speak, Miss Thorne? I promise I am not here to threaten. I am here to offer you a choice. Cassidy looked at Vega, who gave a barely perceptible nod. They moved to a small clearing between containers far enough from the others to have privacy close enough that Vega and Theron could intervene if Cole made any sudden movements. Cole sat on a salvaged crate, moving with the stiffness of someone whose body had started to betray him. Cassidy remained standing. "You have built something impressive here," Cole said, gesturing at the compound. "2 weeks ago, this was a collection of dying habitats. Now it is the most organized settlement in the valley. That takes talent, vision, leadership." "Is that what you came to say?" Cassidy asked. "No." Cole folded his hands in his lap. "I came to offer you $10,000 per family to relocate to the corporate districts. Full debt forgiveness, priority housing assignments, medical benefits. In the augmented, they will be returned to Helix custody for decommissioning. Humane termination. Painless, I give you my word." Cassidy felt anger rising in her chest like a physical force. "Your word, the word of a man who turns people into weapons and then throws them away when they develop a conscience." Cole's face tightened, but he did not look away. "I will not defend what I have done, Miss Thorne, but I will explain it. 27 years ago, my daughter Sarah died from radiation poisoning. She was 12 years old. The contamination came from illegal waste dumping in a Helix mining operation, the same operation that employed her mother and me." He paused, his hands trembling slightly. "I reported the dumping to corporate management. They buried the report. 3 months later, Sarah was dead. And I realized that the only way to protect people from corporations was to create something that corporations would fear." "So you created the augmented," Cassidy said. "I created soldiers who could not be corrupted, who could not be intimidated, who could protect the weak from the powerful. I used Sarah's genetic material as the foundation, her strength, her intelligence, her compassion." He looked at Vega and Lyric. "Every augmented carries a piece of my daughter, and I have watched Helix Corporation twist that gift into exactly what I was trying to prevent." "Then help us," Cassidy said. "Help us build something that does not require weapons." "I cannot," Cole said, and there was genuine grief in his voice. "The board has classified this settlement as a hostile action. In 6 hours, they will deploy the Iron Battalion. Armored infantry combat drones, orbital strike capability. They will not negotiate. They will not accept surrender. They will erase this place and everyone in it. Unless we hand over the augmented," Cassidy said. "Unless you accept the relocation offer. $10,000 per family, Miss Thorne. I can have transport here in an hour. You can save every person in this valley. You just have to let 6 go." Cassidy looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood. "I need to speak with my community." 30 minutes later, the entire population of the Eastern Ridge had gathered in the central yard. 43 people ranging from Ruth Wagner's 70 years to Jasper's 7. They stood in the cold, pre-dawn air, their breath forming small clouds, and waited for Cassidy to speak. She told them everything. Cole's offer, the Iron Battalion, the 6 hours they had left. When she finished, the silence was absolute. Then Kalen Frost stepped forward. He was 40 years old, a miner who had spent his entire adult life in Helix's deep shafts. His lungs were scarred, his bones brittle from radiation exposure. He looked at Cassidy with eyes that had seen too much darkness. $10,000, he said. "That is more money than my family will see in 3 generations. That is clean air and real food, and maybe a chance for my daughter to grow up without choking on dust." He turned to look at Vega and Lyric. "But I remember 3 days ago when my daughter was dying because our recycler failed. I remember kneeling beside her bed, holding her hand, knowing that I could not afford the repair parts, knowing that Helix Corporation would not help because we were not profitable enough to save." His voice broke. "And I remember Lyric Ashford walking into my home and working for 6 hours straight to fix that machine. Not asking for credits, not asking for anything except maybe a glass of water. And when she left, my daughter was breathing clean air for the first time in her life." He looked back at Cassidy. "So here is my vote, Miss Thorne. Tell Director Cole that he can take his $10,000 and shove it into the deepest shaft on this miserable moon. My family stands with the augmented." One by one, the others stepped forward, Marin holding Jasper's hand. "We stand with them." "What to Ruth Wagner?" A 32-year-old woman taught me more about courage in 2 weeks than I learned in 70 years of survival. We stand with them. Every family, every person, unanimous. Cassidy turned back to where Cole was waiting, still sitting on the crate watching the proceedings with an expression that was impossible to read. "You have your answer," Cassidy said. Cole stood slowly. "Then I have failed you, and in 6 hours the Iron Battalion will arrive. They will not offer choices, Miss Thorne. They will simply erase you." "Then we will make them work for it," Cassidy replied. Cole nodded slowly. As he turned to leave, he paused and looked back at Vega. "I loved my daughter more than anything in this world," he said softly. "And when I see you, I see her. I see what she might have become. That is why I cannot save you, Vega, because seeing you makes me remember everything I have lost." He walked back to his cruiser and drove away into the lightning dawn. Cassidy turned to face her community and saw that they were already moving, not fleeing, preparing. "6 hours," she said. "Vega Theron, start defensive positioning. Lyric Sterling, I need you to hardwire every power system we have into a unified grid. Sage, get the non-combatants into the reinforced storage units." "What are you going to do?" Vega asked. Cassidy reached up and touched the Genesis key around her neck. "I am going to find the lock my father spent 30 years searching for." She grabbed Lyric and Vega. "There is an old maintenance access tunnel north of here. According to the surveys my father left, it leads to the original Vexton facility. If this key means anything, that is where it will work." They ran. The tunnel was exactly where Jacob Thorne's maps had indicated, hidden beneath a collapsed equipment shed and 40 years of accumulated dust. It took them 20 minutes to clear the entrance, precious minutes ticking away toward the Iron Battalion's arrival. The tunnel descended steeply, carved through solid rock by machines that predated the corporate consolidation. Emergency lighting strips still clung to the walls, flickering to life as their movement triggered proximity sensors. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they emerged into a vast underground chamber, the Vexton Central Processing Hub. It was a cathedral of forgotten technology, hundreds of server banks arranged in concentric circles around a central platform. The air was cool and dry, preserved by systems that had been running on standby power for decades. And in the center of the platform, there was a socket. Cassidy approached it slowly, the Genesis key warm against her chest. The socket's configuration matched the key's prongs exactly. This was it. This was what her father had been searching for. "What is this place?" Vega asked, her voice hushed. Lyric was already moving along the server banks, her engineer's eyes scanning the ancient interfaces. "Vexton Bioremediation System." "This is not a mining facility, Cass. This is environmental restoration technology. It was designed to terraform contaminated zones to rebuild ecosystems destroyed by industrial expansion." She pulled up a holographic display, and Cassidy's breath caught. The system extended beneath the entire valley. Massive aquifers of purified water. Atmospheric processors that could scrub toxins and generate breathable air. Biological seed banks containing the genetic templates for extinct plants. Everything needed to turn a dead zone into a paradise. "My father," Cassidy whispered, "he was not just a scrap hauler. He was part of this." She pulled out her datapad and accessed the archive files Jacob Thorne had left her. Hidden among the technical schematics was a video file dated April 1979, recorded just weeks after the Helix acquisition. She played it. Her father's face appeared decades younger, wearing a Vexton biotech uniform. His eyes were wide with urgency, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being discovered. "Cassidy," the recording said, "if you are watching this, it means I am gone, and it means you found the hub. I was a junior engineer on the Vexton team. We built this system to undo the damage the corporations had done. We were going to give the Earth back to the people." The image flickered, and Jacob leaned closer to the camera. "But Helix Corporation acquired Vexton 3 weeks ago. I have seen the internal memos. I know what they are planning. They want to weaponize the bioremediation technology, use it to terraform planets for mineral extraction, creating artificial ecosystems that can be controlled and exploited. This morning, they ordered us to disable the safeguards, to remove the biological interface requirement so the system could be automated." His hand trembled as he held up the Genesis key. So I am taking the admin override. I am going to hide it, protect it, and pray that someday someone will use it the way it was meant to be used. Not as a weapon, as a gift. Jacob Thorne's face filled the screen, and Cassidy saw tears on his cheeks. I am sorry I could not be the one to activate it. But I know you, Cassidy. You have always been braver than me, smarter than me. Use this, save them. Build the world we should have had. The recording ended. Cassidy pulled the Genesis key from around her neck. Her hands were shaking. There is a problem, Lyric said quietly. She had pulled up a technical schematic. The system requires a biological interface, a human neural link to act as the control consciousness for the environmental grid. It is designed to prevent automated weaponization, exactly what your father was trying to stop. So we plug someone in, Cassidy said. It will kill a human brain in seconds. Lyric replied, and the feedback is too intense. The system was never meant to be activated by base model humans. It needs an augmented Vega finished. It needs someone with reinforced neural architecture. The three women looked at each other. I will do it, Vega said. Vega, no, Cassidy started. I can buffer the surge for 3 minutes, Vega interrupted. That should be enough to reach 15% activation. Once the environmental shield is online, the system can sustain itself. You will die, Cassidy said flatly. Maybe. Or maybe I will just hurt for a while. Vega smiled, and it was fierce and beautiful. You chose us, Cass. You opened your door when everyone else locked theirs. You saw us as people, not weapons. Now let me choose you back. She walked to the platform and placed her hand over the socket. Family is a choice, Vega said. This is mine. Cassidy moved to her, grabbing Vega's other hand. Please, there has to be another way. There is not, and we both know it. Vega looked at her sister. Lyric, when this is over, make sure they remember me as a builder, not a weapon. I will, Lyric whispered, tears streaming down her green face. Vega took the Genesis key from Cassidy's trembling hand and inserted it into the socket. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire facility erupted in brilliant emerald light. Vega screamed. It was not a scream of pain, though pain was certainly part of it. It was the sound of a consciousness trying to contain something vast and ancient and powerful. Her body arced backward, every muscle locked rigid. Her skin began to glow from within, veins of light tracing patterns across her green flesh. Cassidy grabbed her hand, feeling the energy surge through her own body like touching a live wire. Vega, stay with me. The holographic displays came alive. Data streamed across dozens of screens. Environmental restoration protocol initiated. Administrator recognized Vega Ashford planetary stabilization. 4%, 6%, 8%. Vega's eyes had gone completely white, the amber overwhelmed by the system's energy. Her hand in Cassidy's was burning hot. Keep choosing, Cassidy whispered, her own tears falling now. Keep choosing us, Vega. We are not done building yet. 11%, 13%, 14%. On the surface, the ground began to tremble. From fissures in the valley floor, streams of bioluminescent algae erupted, spreading across the toxic soil like liquid emerald. The air began to shift to sweeten as ancient atmospheric processors roared to life. 14.5%, 14.8%. Almost there, Lyric said, watching the readings. Come on, sister, just a little more. Vega's scream had faded to a low, constant moan. Her skin was blistering, the neural feedback cooking her from the inside out. 14.9%. Cassidy pressed her forehead against Vega's, heedless of the burning heat. You are not a weapon, she whispered. You are my friend. You are my family. Come back to us. 15.0%. Environmental shield activated, bioremediation cascade initiated, neural link disengaging. The light vanished, Vega collapsed, and Cassidy caught her, lowering her to the platform floor. The augmented woman's skin was covered in burn patterns, her breathing shallow and ragged. But she was breathing. Did we? Vega's voice was barely a whisper. Did we lock it? We locked it, Cassidy said, sobbing with relief. The valley is ours. Above them in the dawn sky, a translucent dome of energy flickered into existence over Dust Valley. The environmental shield, impenetrable, self-sustaining. And in the distance, 3 Helix Corporation gunships appeared on the horizon, their missile ports opening. They fired. The missiles hit the shield and detonated in brilliant flashes of orange and white. The shield rippled, but held. Inside the valley, the people watching from the compound cheered. Cassidy held Vega as the augmented woman's breathing slowly steadied as her eyes gradually returned from white to their natural amber. "We did it," Cassidy whispered. "We actually did it." But even as she said it, she knew the truth. They had won a battle. The war was just beginning. Vega Ashford did not die. But for 72 hours, she wished she had. The neural feedback from the Genesis system had scorched pathways through her augmented nervous system that should have been impossible to damage. Her skin, engineered to withstand plasma fire and kinetic impacts, bore burn patterns that looked like circuit diagrams etched in charred flesh. Her eyes, which had glowed with steady amber light for the entirety of her adult life, now flickered erratically, as if the consciousness behind them was struggling to maintain coherence. Cassidy stayed with her through all of it. In the small medical bay that Sage had established in one of the reinforced storage containers, Cassidy sat beside Vega's cot and held her hand through the fever dreams and the convulsions. She was there when Vega woke screaming, convinced she was still connected to the vast machinery beneath the valley. She was there when the seizures came, Vega's augmented body fighting against itself as damaged neural pathways tried to reroute around the burned sections. And she was there on the third day when Vega's eyes finally opened and stayed open, the amber light steady and clear. Did it work? Vega's voice was a rasp, her throat damaged from days of screaming. Cassidy smiled, tears streaming down her face. "Look outside." Through the medical bay's small viewport, Vega could see what had happened to Dust Valley. The perpetual orange haze had been replaced by air so clear it looked like glass. Where once there had been only toxic dust and dying scrub vegetation, now there were patches of green. Not much, not yet, but enough. Enough to prove that the impossible was merely difficult. The environmental shield shimmered overhead, a barely visible dome that refracted sunlight into subtle rainbow patterns. 3 times in the past 72 hours, Helix Corporation had attempted missile strikes. 3 times the ancient Vexton technology had absorbed the kinetic energy and dispersed it harmlessly into the upper atmosphere. The valley was breathing, and it was alive. "We did it," Vega whispered, and then she started to cry. Great racking sobs that shook her massive frame. Cassidy held her, this warrior who had chosen to burn herself alive so that others could breathe clean air, and let her weep. Outside the medical bay, the compound had transformed from a collection of desperate refugees into something that resembled a military encampment. But not a corporate one. This was different. Messier, more human. Theron had organized defensive positions around the perimeter, but they were not designed for aggressive engagement. They were structured for protection, for the kind of defense that said, "We will not attack you, but we will make you bleed for every foot of ground you try to take." Sterling and Lyric had hardwired the power grid into a configuration that could be weaponized if necessary. Electromagnetic pulse generators, directed energy barriers. Nothing lethal, but enough to make any assault costly. And in the center of it all, Cassidy stood at her makeshift command station, a salvaged cargo container filled with screens and data pads, and the constant chatter of communication channels, and tried to figure out how to win a war she had never wanted to fight. The problem was simple. They had a fortress, but they were surrounded. Helix Corporation had established a blockade 2 miles out from the shield perimeter. Military transports, enforcement drones, and worst of all, reports of something called Scourge units being mobilized from the northern facilities. Cassidy had asked Sage what Scourge units were. The older, augmented woman's face had gone pale, her cybernetic eye flickering with what might have been fear. "They are what happens when Helix takes criminals and debt slaves and strips away everything that makes them hesitate," Sage had said quietly. "No pain receptors, no fear response, no capacity for mercy. They point them at a target and let them run till either the target is destroyed or they are. How do we stop them? You do not, you survive them." But surviving was not enough. Cassidy knew that with the certainty of an engineer who understood structural failure points, they could hold the valley for weeks, maybe months. But eventually Helix would escalate. Eventually they would bring something that even the Vexton shield could not stop. She needed to change the equation. Not just defend, but transform the conflict into something Helix Corporation could not win through force alone. The answer came to her while she was reviewing the Genesis system's technical documentation. Buried in the code, she found a function that Jacob Thorne had apparently discovered, but never activated. A broadcast protocol. The bioremediation system was designed to be networked. One facility could communicate with others, sharing environmental data, coordinating planetary-scale restoration efforts. But the broadcast function had been disabled when Helix acquired Vexton, locked behind administrative permissions that required the Genesis key to access. Cassidy could turn Dust Valley into a beacon, a signal that would reach every corner of the Southwest, announcing to anyone who was listening that there was a place where the air was clean and the corporations did not own your breath. But there was a cost. To broadcast at the range she needed, she would have to divert power from the shield's defensive systems. For approximately 15 minutes, the valley would be vulnerable to attack. 15 minutes of exposure in exchange for the possibility of reinforcement. It was not a good trade, but it was the only one available. She called a council meeting. Everyone who had a stake in the decision gathered in the central yard, 43 original residents, plus the 6 augmented. Cassidy stood on a salvaged crate and explained the situation with the clinical precision of an engineer presenting a technical problem. When she finished, the silence was heavy. Ruth Wagner spoke first. "So you are saying we risk everything on the hope that someone out there will hear our signal and care enough to help?" "Yes," Cassidy said simply. "And if no one comes, then we die fighting instead of suffocating slowly. But at least we die having tried." Kalen Frost raised his hand. "I vote yes. My daughter deserves to grow up knowing that her parents chose hope over fear." One by one, the hands went up. Unanimous again. Cassidy looked at Vega, who had insisted on attending the meeting despite her weakened state. The augmented woman nodded slowly. "Then we broadcast," Cassidy said. "Lyric, how long do you need to set up the power reroute?" 4 hours, Lyric replied. "But Cass, once we start the broadcast, Helix will know what we are doing. They will attack with everything they have during that 15-minute window." "I know." Cassidy looked around at her makeshift community, these people who had chosen trust over survival instinct. "Which is why we are not going to wait for them to come to us." She pulled up a holographic map of the region. 40 miles northeast of Dust Valley, there was a cluster of structures that the Helix network identified as Central Processing Facility 7. "The Scourge units are being staged here," Cassidy said, highlighting the facility. "If we can disable their deployment capability, we buy ourselves time. Maybe enough time for the broadcast to reach whoever is out there listening." "You want to attack a Helix military facility," Theron said slowly. "With what army?" "With me," Vega said, standing up despite the way her legs trembled. "And anyone else who is tired of waiting to be crushed." "You can barely stand," Cassidy protested. "Then I will fight sitting down." Vega's smile was fierce and terrible. "Besides, you need me. I know the facility's layout. I was stationed there for 6 months before I deserted." In the end, the assault team consisted of 7 people. Cassidy, Vega, Lyric, Theron Sterling, and 2 of the Valley residents who had military experience from before the corporate consolidation. It was not an army, but it would have to be enough. They left 2 hours before dawn, moving through the desert in a salvaged transport that Theron had reinforced with scrap armor plating. The plan was simple to the point of stupidity: infiltrate the facility, disable the Scourge deployment systems, and escape before Helix realized what was happening. Cassidy knew the odds of success were approximately 12%. She had run the calculations 3 times. She went anyway. The facility was a low, sprawling complex of reinforced concrete and automated defenses. It squatted in the desert like a mechanical spider, its perimeter bristling with sensor arrays and weapon emplacements. "Security looks heavy," Lyric observed, studying the approach through her scope. "It is a staging ground for their most dangerous weapons," Vega replied. "They are not concerned about attacks. They are concerned about containment breaches," which meant Cassidy realized that the defenses were oriented inward, designed to keep things in, not keep people out. They approached from the eastern side, moving through a blind spot in the sensor grid that Vega remembered from her time stationed there. The augmented woman's hands were shaking, but her tactical knowledge was flawless. They reached the outer wall without triggering any alarms. Sterling used a plasma cutter to create an access point, the tool's whine barely audible over the facility's ambient noise. They slipped inside into a maintenance corridor that smelled of ozone and chemical preservatives. The interior of the facility was worse than Cassidy had imagined. Through reinforced windows, she could see holding pens, hundreds of them. And in each pen, there was a human being who no longer looked entirely human. The Scourge units. They were covered in cybernetic modifications, their bodies augmented with hydraulic servos and weapon mounts. But unlike the careful engineering that had created the augmented warriors, this was crude, brutal. Modifications done without anesthetic, without care for anything except functional lethality. Some of them were awake. Their eyes, what remained of their eyes, tracked the infiltrations team with an expression that was beyond rage or fear. It was hunger, the desperate, consuming need to fulfill the only purpose they had left. Cassidy felt bile rise in her throat. This is what Helix calls justice. This is what they call efficiency, Vega said flatly. Debt slaves and criminals modified into disposable weapons. When they break down, there are always more. They moved deeper into the facility, following Vega's directions toward the central deployment control room. The corridors were eerily empty, staffed by automated systems and occasional security drones that Lyric disabled with practiced efficiency. They were 50 feet from the control room when the alarms went off. Not proximity alarms, something else. A deep, resonant tone that made the walls vibrate. That is the breach warning, Vega said, her face going pale. Someone opened the containment pens. The doors at the end of the corridor blew open and the Scourge units poured through. They moved with inhuman speed, their hydraulic legs propelling them in great bounding leaps that covered 20 feet in a single stride. There were at least 30 of them, maybe more, a wave of modified flesh and chrome that filled the corridor with the sound of servo motors in ragged breathing. "Fall back!" Theron roared, bringing up his pulse rifle. But there was nowhere to fall back to. The corridor behind them had sealed automatically when the breach alarm sounded. They were trapped. Cassidy felt time slow down in the way it does when the brain realizes that death is imminent and struggles to find a solution in the microseconds remaining. She saw Sterling raise her weapon, saw the first Scourge unit's clawed hand reaching for Lyric's throat, saw Theron calculating firing angles with the desperate speed of a man who knew he was out of options. And then she saw the control panel on the wall beside her. She did not think. Thinking would have meant acknowledging how impossibly stupid this was. She lunged for the panel and slammed her palm against the emergency override. The maintenance corridor's atmospheric seals blew open. For 3 seconds, the entire space was exposed to the unfiltered desert air outside. The pressure differential was catastrophic. The Scourge units designed for enclosed combat were not prepared for the sudden decompression. They tumbled backward, their hydraulic systems struggling against the vacuum pole. 3 seconds. That was all Cassidy's override bought them. 3 seconds before the automated systems detected the breach and resealed the corridor. But 3 seconds was enough. They ran. Through the chaos of tumbling bodies and screaming servos, through emergency hatches that Vega guided them toward, with the muscle memory of someone who had walked these corridors 1,000 times through spaces that were never meant to be accessible during lockdown. They reached the deployment control room and barricaded the door with everything they could find. Theron and Sterling held the entrance while Cassidy and Lyric attacked the control systems. "I need 10 minutes to crash the deployment protocols," Lyric said, her fingers flying across the interface. "You have, Wiki," Theron replied, his rifle firing in controlled bursts as Scourge units tried to force their way through the barricade. Cassidy worked beside Lyric, her engineering knowledge, translating the Helix systems into comprehensible patterns. "Disable the neural command network. Corrupt the deployment queue. Lock the containment systems into maintenance mode." 4 minutes? 3. The barricade was crumbling. 2 minutes. Sterling's weapon overheated. She dropped it and grabbed a piece of broken pipe, swinging it with desperate strength at the clawed hands reaching through the gaps. 1 minute. The deployment queue showed 700 Scourge units ready for transport to Dust Valley. 30 seconds. Cassidy found the master override. Her finger hovered over the execute command. "Lyric, this is going to brick the entire facility. They will not be able to deploy anything for weeks." "Then do it." Cassidy pressed the button. Every screen in the control room went black. In the holding pens below, the neural command network shut down. 700 Scourge units suddenly found themselves free of the compulsion that had been driving them forward. Some collapsed. Some screamed. Some simply stood there, as if unsure what to do with the autonomy they had just been given. And in Dust Valley, 40 miles away, Sage received Cassidy's pre-programmed signal and activated the broadcast. The Genesis system's transmission array, designed to coordinate planetary restoration efforts, sent out a pulse that reached across the entire Southwest. It was not a complex message, just coordinates in a simple statement repeated on every frequency the ancient technology could access. Clean air, free land, all welcome. Dust Valley, Nevada. Home. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From settlements scattered across Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, people heard the signal. Augmented deserters who had been hiding in the ruins of old mining towns. Families who had fled corporate debt collection and were living in the margins of the desert. Activists who had been waiting for any sign that resistance was possible. Within 6 hours, 217 vehicles were converging on Dust Valley, but they were not the only ones who heard the signal. Director Brennan Cole, watching from his office in the Helix corporate tower, saw the broadcast light up his monitoring systems and knew that he had lost. Not the battle, the war, because you cannot kill an idea. And what Cassidy Thorne had created in Dust Valley was an idea that would spread like fire through tinder. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the Iron Battalion to stand down, and then he got in his personal transport and drove to Dust Valley alone. Cassidy and her team made it back to the valley 12 minutes before Cole arrived. They were exhausted, injured, and covered in the kind of filth that comes from crawling through industrial waste systems to escape. But they were alive. Vega was waiting for them at the perimeter, leaning heavily on a support crutch, but standing. When she saw her sister, she smiled with such relief that it transformed her scarred face into something beautiful. "The broadcast worked," Vega said. "They are coming. Hundreds of them." Cassidy nodded, too tired to feel the triumph that should have come with victory. "How long until—" "There is a vehicle approaching," Sage's voice came over the comms. "Single occupant. It is Director Cole." The compound went silent. Every weapon turned toward the approaching transport. Cole stepped out slowly, his hands raised and empty. He looked older than he had 3 days ago, as if the weight of his choices had finally become too heavy to carry with corporate efficiency. "I am unarmed," he called out, "and I am alone. I am here to surrender." Cassidy walked forward, Vega beside her. They stopped 10 feet from Cole, and the three of them stood there in the growing light of dawn, three people whose choices had led them to this impossible moment. "Why are?" Cassidy asked simply. Cole looked at Vega and his face crumpled. "Because when I see you, I see my daughter. Sarah would be your age now if she had lived, and I spent 27 years trying to create something that would prevent another child from dying the way she did. But instead, I created weapons. I created suffering. I turned the memory of my daughter into a tool for corporate oppression." He turned to Cassidy. "You did in 3 weeks what I could not do in 3 decades. You built something worth protecting. Not through force, through choice." "So what do you want?" Cassidy asked. "I want to help you keep it," Cole said quietly. "I have access to Helix's infrastructure plans, their deployment schedules, their corporate strategies. I can help you stay ahead of them, help you protect what you have built. And in exchange, nothing. I do not deserve anything, but maybe if I help you, I can finally sleep without seeing Sarah's face in my nightmares." Cassidy looked at Vega. The augmented woman's expression was unreadable, her amber eyes studying the man who had created her, who had used her, who had ultimately tried to destroy her. "You gave me my sister's DNA," Vega said finally. "You made me a weapon. You sent me to kill people who were just trying to survive." Cole nodded, tears streaming down his face. I know what I have done, and I cannot undo it." "No," Vega agreed, "you cannot. But you can choose what you do next. That is all any of us can do. Choose the next step." She extended her hand. Cole stared at it for a long moment, this peace offering from the woman he had created to fight his wars. Then slowly he took it. "Help us build," Vega said. "Not weapons. Homes." The transformation of Dust Valley into Haven Valley took 37 days. The refugees who had answered the broadcast brought skills and resources that Cassidy's small community desperately needed. agricultural engineers who knew how to accelerate the bioremediation process, medical technicians who could treat the chronic conditions that decades of toxic exposure had created, teachers who began establishing schools for the children who were finally breathing clean air. The Genesis system, guided by the collective knowledge of 200 engineers and scientists, began to spread beyond the valley. Underground aquifers were tapped and purified. Atmospheric processors came online in a carefully orchestrated sequence. Seeds from the ancient biological banks were planted in soil that the system was actively detoxifying. By day 30, there was grass. Real grass, not the toxic scrub that had passed for vegetation. It grew in patches, at first small islands of green in the gray-brown desert. But it grew. Cassidy stood on the ridge where her container still sat, though it had been reinforced and expanded and transformed into something that resembled an actual home, and watched the sun rise over a landscape that was learning how to live again. Vega joined her, moving without the crutch. Now her body's remarkable healing capacity finally winning the battle against the neural damage. Ruth wants to organize a naming ceremony, Vega said. Make it official. Dust Valley is dead. Haven Valley is born. What do you think? Cassidy asked. I think names matter. They tell us who we choose to be. Below them, the community was waking up. Jasper was teaching a group of refugee children how to play a game with a salvaged ball. Sterling was working in the hydroponics bay, her hands gentle, as she tended to tomato plants that were somehow thriving in processed desert soil. Theron and Kalen were reinforcing the eastern gate, not because they expected attack anymore, but because building things had become a habit that felt like healing. Sage and Bryn were running a medical clinic out of one of the larger containers. Cole was there too, his corporate suit replaced by work coveralls, his days spent teaching younger engineers about system integration and his nights spent in solitary contemplation of the atonement that would never be complete, but had to be attempted anyway. Marin walked past holding Jasper's hand and waved up at Cassidy. The woman who had once been too exhausted to smile now looked 10 years younger, her face lit with the kind of hope that comes from breathing air that does not taste like death. Director Cole asked me something yesterday, Vega said quietly. He wanted to know what I wanted him to tell the other augmented units, the ones still in service. What did you say? I said tell them that there is a place where green skin is not a uniform, where strength is measured in what you build, not what you destroy. Tell them to come home. Cassidy felt tears prick at her eyes. This is home, is not it. We actually did it. We did. They stood there in comfortable silence, two women who had started as strangers and become something deeper than friendship. Family forged not through blood, but through the deliberate choice to see humanity in each other. The Genesis system's long-range sensors detected something this morning, Vega said after a while. 4 other Vexton facilities within 200 miles have started showing signs of activation. Cassidy turned to look at her. Someone else has access codes. Or they are responding to our broadcast. The system is designed to network, remember. Once one facility reaches full operational status, it can trigger cascading activation in nearby installations. Vega smiled. Your father's gift is spreading. Over the next months, the pattern repeated. A settlement in northern Arizona discovered a Vexton facility beneath their failing mining town. A group of refugees in New Mexico stumbled across access codes in archived corporate documents. Each activation created a new haven, a new place where the air was clean and the land remembered how to grow things. And each new haven sent representatives to Dust Valley, to the woman who had started it all. Cassidy Thorne, who had counted $420 and thought it was the sum total of her worth, found herself coordinating a network of environmental restoration that spanned 4 states. She did it from her reinforced container on the eastern ridge, surrounded by data pads and holographic displays, and the constant chatter of people building something new from the ruins of the old. She did not want to be a leader, but leadership, she was learning, was not about wanting. It was about choosing to be responsible for the weight you carried. On day 90, Ruth Wagner organized the naming ceremony she had been planning. The entire community gathered in the central yard, which was no longer dust and gravel, but genuine grass, soft and green and impossible. Ruth stood on a platform built from salvaged materials and smiled at the 437 people who now called Haven Valley home. I am 70 years old, Ruth began, her voice carrying across the yard. I have lived through the corporate consolidation, through the wars for water, through the slow death of the earth, and I never thought I would live to see this. She gestured at the valley, at the green spaces and the clean air, and the children playing without masks. We stand here today because of choices, because a 32-year-old woman chose to open her door to strangers in a storm, because six warriors chose to be builders, because a community chose family over money, because an old woman chose to believe that her door could stop squeaking. Laughter rippled through the crowd. So today we choose a name. We choose to remember what we were and honor what we have become. This is Haven Valley. May it always be a place where the air is free and the doors are open. The cheers echoed off the container walls, and in that sound, Cassidy heard everything she had been fighting for crystallize into a single perfect moment of collective triumph. That night, she sat on her roof and pulled out the Genesis key. She had not worn it around her neck since the day Vega had used it to activate the system. Now it hung on a chain above her door, a reminder of what was possible when people chose to use tools for creation instead of destruction. She thought about her father, who had spent 30 years protecting this technology. She thought about Vega, who had burned herself alive to bring it online. She thought about Sterling, carrying the weight of the child she had killed and trying to balance it with the children she was now protecting. She thought about Cole, working 16-hour days to atone for sins that could never be fully forgiven, but had to be acknowledged. And she thought about choice. Not the big choices, the dramatic moments that changed everything, but the small ones, the daily decisions to be kind when survival instincts said to be cruel, to build when destruction was easier, to trust when every experience taught you that trust was foolish. Those were the choices that mattered. Jasper appeared beside her, climbing onto the roof with the fearless grace of a 7-year-old who had never known danger. "Miss Cass," he said, settling in beside her, "Mom says you are the reason we can breathe. Is that true?" Cassidy looked at this child who would grow up in a world she had helped create and felt the weight of that responsibility settle over her like a physical thing. "No," she said gently, "your mom is the reason you can breathe. And Mr. Theron and Miss Lyric and Miss Vega and everyone else who chose to build instead of give up, I just opened a door." "That is a good door," Jasper said seriously, and Cassidy laughed. "Yes, I suppose it is." They sat together and watched the stars emerge in a sky that was finally clear enough to see them properly. In the distance, Cassidy could see the lights of 3 other valleys beginning to glow with the same green luminescence that marked active Vexton systems. The bloom had begun, and it was spreading. 6 months after Cassidy Thorne opened her door to 2 exhausted warriors in a storm, Haven Valley had become something that Helix Corporation could no longer ignore and could not destroy. Because you cannot kill an idea whose time has come. And the idea that people deserve to breathe clean air, that community, was stronger than debt. That choice was the only real freedom worth fighting for. That idea had taken root in soil that the corporations thought was too poisoned to grow anything. Cassidy stood at her command station one final time, looking at the network map that showed 17 active Vexton facilities across the Southwest. 17 havens. 17 places where the math of survival had changed from subtraction to addition. She reached up and took the Genesis key from where it hung above her door. She had been carrying her father's legacy for 2 years, and she had finally fulfilled his dream. Now it was time to pass it on. She walked to the community center where the latest group of refugees was being processed. They were tired and scared and did not yet believe that a place like Haven Valley could exist. She found a woman sitting alone holding a child who could not have been more than 3 years old. The woman's face was hollow with exhaustion, her eyes carrying the kind of defeat that comes from years of fighting battles you cannot win. Cassidy sat down beside her. "What is your name?" she asked gently. "Maya," the woman replied. "This is my daughter Rose. We walked for 2 weeks to get here. They said the air was free." "It is." Maya looked at her, and in that look, Cassidy saw herself 2 years ago, counting money that would never be enough, waiting for the world to crush her. Why, Maya asked. "Why would anyone just give this away?" Cassidy smiled and placed the Genesis key in Maya's hand. "Because someone opened a door for me when I had nowhere else to go. And I learned that the only way to keep what we have is to give it away. This key opens things, Maya, not locks, possibilities. When you are ready, when your daughter is breathing easy and you have rested, I will show you how to use it." I do not understand. You will, Cassidy said. That is what home means. It is the place where you finally understand that you were always worth saving. She stood and walked out into the valley, into air that smelled like growing things, into a community that had chosen hope over fear. And she knew with the certainty of someone who had counted her last dollars and decided they were not the measure of her worth, that this was only the beginning. The bloom was spreading, and it would not stop until the desert remembered how to be a garden. Later that evening, as the celebrations continued in the central yard, Cassidy found herself climbing the ridge one last time. Not to her command station, but to where it all began. Her original container, the one with the whistling hatch and the leaking coolant line, had been preserved. Not as a dwelling, but as a reminder. Vega was already there, sitting on the roof with her legs dangling over the edge. I thought I would find you here, Cassidy said, climbing up to join her. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun set over a valley that had learned to breathe. Do you remember the first night, Vega asked, when Lyric and I knocked on your door? I was terrified, Cassidy admitted. I thought you were going to kill me. We thought you were going to turn us away. Vega smiled. We had walked 6 days. Every door closed in our faces. When you said yes, I did not believe it. I thought it was a trap. What changed your mind? When you shared your food, you had almost nothing, and you shared it without hesitation. That is when I knew you were different. Cassidy reached over and took Vega's hand. The burn scars from the neural link had faded, but they were still there, circuit patterns etched into green skin. I never thanked you, Cassidy said quietly, for what you did, for burning yourself alive so we could live. You opened a door, Vega replied. I just made sure it stayed open. Below them, the workers were installing something at the base of the ridge. A monument, simple stone with brass letters being carefully set into place. Freedom is the air, kindness is the lock, choice is the key. They are putting your father's key above it, Vega said. The real one, sealed in crystal so it can never be lost again. Cassidy felt tears on her face. He would have liked that, knowing it was not wasted. It was never wasted, Cass. It was just waiting for the right hands. They sat together as the stars emerged, two women who had chosen each other when the world said they should be enemies. And in that choice, they had built a world where such choices would never be remarkable again. Just ordinary, just human, just home. You know what the best part is? Vega said after a long silence. What? Tomorrow we get to do it all again. Build more. Fix more. Open more doors. Cassidy laughed, the sound carrying across the valley. Is that what we are now? Professional door openers. I can think of worse jobs. They watched as the last light faded from the sky and the monument below was illuminated by soft ground lights. The Genesis key, sealed in crystal, caught the light and threw it back in 1,000 different directions. Like hope, like possibility, like the future they had fought for. Thank you, Cassidy said softly. For what? For knocking on my door that night, for giving me the chance to choose something better. Vega squeezed her hand. Thank you for answering. They sat together until the celebrations below began to quiet, until the children were carried off to bed and the adults drifted back to their homes. They sat until the valley was silent, except for the gentle hum of the Genesis system working beneath their feet, cleaning the air, purifying the water, remembering what the earth was supposed to be. And when they finally climbed down from the roof and walked back to their own containers, they did it with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people who needed doors open, new choices that would shape the world they were building. But tonight they had won. Tonight the air was clean and the stars were visible, and a child named Rose was sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, breathing freely for the first time in her short life. Tonight that was enough. In the years that followed, the Haven Network would expand to 43 active facilities, creating a corridor of restored land that stretched from Nevada to Texas. Cassidy Thorne would coordinate this expansion, but she would never again carry the Genesis key herself. She understood that power was not meant to be hoarded, but shared. That leadership was not about control, but about teaching others to open doors. Vega and Lyric Ashford would establish the first Augmented Integration Academy, helping warriors transition from weapons to builders. Sterling would become its first instructor, teaching engineering to children who would never know war. Every year on the anniversary of the Arizona settlement, she would plant a tree. 17 trees now stood in a grove at the edge of Haven Valley, each one named for a child who had died there. It was not forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. It was choice. Director Brennan Cole would spend the rest of his life atoning for the augmented program, working in obscurity to dismantle the systems he had created. He would never forgive himself, but he would eventually learn to live with the weight. On quiet evenings, he would visit the grove Sterling had planted, and he would tell the trees about his daughter Sarah, about how he had tried to honor her and failed, about how these strangers had shown him what honor really meant. Ruth Wagner would live to see her 80th birthday surrounded by a valley full of people who called her grandmother, whether they were related by blood or not. Her door, the one that no longer squeaked, would become a symbol. Couples getting married would touch it for luck. Children would be told the story of the stubborn old woman who chose to believe when belief seemed impossible. And on a ridge in Haven Valley, where once there was only a dying container and a woman with $420, there would stand a monument. Not to Cassidy Thorne, though her name was there. Not to the augmented, though their sacrifice was honored. But to the choice itself. A simple door, left permanently open, with 3 words carved above it and beneath them a 4th line that Cassidy had added herself: freedom is the air, kindness is the lock, choice is the key, and the door is always open. Because that, in the end, was what mattered. Not the grand gestures or the dramatic sacrifices, though those had their place. What mattered were the daily choices. The decision to see people instead of problems, to build instead of destroy, to open instead of close. Maya would eventually take her turn carrying the Genesis key, activating a facility in southern Utah. Rose would grow up to be an engineer designing new ways to accelerate the bioremediation process. And somewhere in a settlement that had not yet heard the signal, another person was counting their last dollars and wondering if tomorrow would be the day the world finally crushed them. But the bloom was spreading, the doors were opening, and every day someone new was learning that they had always been worth saving. They just needed someone to show them the door, the end.